just begin by welcoming Vernon Bellecourt to the city of Burlington, and Troy Lang, your company is Bellecourt? Yes. Okay, and Joanne Golden, who is active in the Burlington Federal Basis City Program. I'm sorry, your name is?
Jamie Warhurst.
Jamie, you are with?
Sister City and Treaty Council.
Okay. Mr. Bellecourt, I think as many people know, has been very active in the American Indian movement for a number of years. He has also been to Nicaragua on numerous occasions. So let me formally welcome you to our city. We're delighted to have you here.
Well, we're very happy to be here, Mayor. It's happy to be to the sister city of Puerto Cabeza and to work with the many people in the community who have a relationship with the peoples of Nicaragua. It's very important that we develop and strengthen these relationships.
Vernon, if I might, maybe let me just start off with a very simple and obvious question. What is your feeling about the United States' attitude and support for the Contras against the people of Nicaragua?
Well, first of all, everywhere we've traveled throughout Nicaragua, beginning in 1980, shortly after the triumph of the revolution, we watched as the situation deteriorated in that almost immediately after the revolution, the counter-revolutionary forces began to work with some success of sowing division, disruption, confusion, and in fact, it seemed at that time that they were gaining headway in order to turn the Atlantic Coast peoples against the revolution. And for the reason that most people know, the Atlantic Coast had been historically isolated from the Pacific Coast. Certainly, this historical alienation also brought about a situation where it was then easy for some of the people that were manipulating the Atlantic Coast peoples to be able to turn many against the revolution. And of course, with the refugee problem, as it was during that time, with peoples in Honduras being recruited to fight alongside the Contra, for our experience, it sort of was a reflection of our own history when the United States was able to, beginning on the eastern seaboard here, many times able to get various leaders of our peoples to literally become scouts for the cavalry and ride against other tribes. So we could see the same thing happening in Nicaragua in the Contra War. Obviously, the concept of the Contra War is sort of word games to cause more confusion. This is really an American war against the peoples of Nicaragua, which war has really been the principal cause of the suffering of the peoples of Nicaragua. As you know, more than half of their gross revenues have to go to defense. And it's sort of a sad thing to see a big, powerful government like the United States perpetrating a war against the tiny country of Nicaragua with a little more than 3 million people who are in effect trying to do their own thing, trying to establish a socialist democratic form of government that in fact takes into consideration the needs of the people versus the needs of the corporations.
I remember when I was down there, what I observed is that in Puerto Cabeza, in fact, they had finally, I guess, after putting a lot of money into it, they had established a freshwater project where the people were for the first time getting decent drinking water. And certainly one of the results of American taxpayers' money for the Contras was the destruction of that,
Yes.
that freshwater plant. My recollection is that Puerto Cabeza had finally, again, being an isolated community on the Atlantic coast, had finally established a telephone hookup with the Pacific area, Managua, and that was broken by the Contra aid. I remember then that there was a hospital, which it's hard to describe the word hospital compared to what many of us know, a very primitive wood hospital. And then in fact their expansion program was hurt because the lumber that they needed to acquire was in Contra area and people were afraid to go out there. So what I observed in my trip to Nicaragua was the direct suffering, not to mention the actual casualties, being brought by the Contras, and I gather that's what you've seen all over.
Yes, that's what we experienced. In fact, since the triumph of the revolution in 1979, for the first time in history, a road was constructed from Matagalpa to Puerto Cabeza, which made it easier access for the peoples of the Atlantic coast to relate to the peoples of the Pacific coast, where before there was this historical isolation and alienation, cultural, linguistic differences, which kept the people divided. And this road is always under attack as well. Many of the bridges have been blown from time to time, and obviously the U.S. war has caused, I would say now, perhaps as much as $500 million in destruction to the economic infrastructure. In other words, the war is creating a condition where it becomes very difficult for people to be able to see the end of this, and consequently, the whole reason is to try to turn the people against the revolution.
When I was in Nicaragua, I mean, what you're saying is exactly true, and it's a very, what's the word, it's an extraordinarily inhuman policy. Because if you can't beat people militarily, what you do is you cause so much economic suffering, so that finally the average person, who is not necessarily political, that person says the cost of food is outrageous, the housing situation, the health situation, the educational situation is poor. What do I need this revolution for? Maybe what the other people are saying is true. Maybe if the government is overthrown, things will be better. And I remember when I was in Nicaragua, and we just went around talking to people. As you know, it's certainly, despite American propaganda, you can go around and talk to anybody you want. And I talked to a family, a husband and wife, living in a very poor house. And I said to them, how is the situation now as opposed to before the revolution? And the woman said, it's better, because we now own this house. It's not much to own it. The husband, on the other hand, said, I don't know that it's better. The tin roof that we have over here, before the revolution, I could buy it for X amount of money. Now it costs me much more.
Yes.
Okay. And clearly that is one of the goals of the Reagan administration, is to cause so much economic turmoil that finally the people are going to become disenchanted with the revolution.
Exactly, but then there's the other side of that, as you know, and others that have traveled there. At the same time that the U.S. war is being perpetrated against the people, it's having the opposite effect, in that many people that were not political are now very resolute and determined to defend this revolution. In other words, what they're really doing is they're forcing the people to consolidate themselves so that they can defend the revolution. And what we heard everywhere is, while the economic situation is difficult, that we intend to defend this revolution. And so I think in the long run, it's serving the opposite of what the United States is trying to achieve. Obviously, in the process of trying to alienate the people from the revolution, it's had its results to an extent. But as we have experienced, we feel that the people are very strongly determined to defend this revolution. The other thing is that the United States is creating the conditions for the suffering in Nicaragua, and at the same time then blaming it on the victims, those that are being victimized, as if it was the leadership of Nicaragua which was the problem. But in reality, in talking to many of the very prominent church leaders like Norman Bent, Bishop Hedley Wilson in the Moravian Protestant Church, as well as other religious leaders, the message is always very clear, that they want to get on with building their future within the revolution. In speaking with many of the Indian leaders who participated in a very active way within the autonomy process, which is bringing about recognition and respect for their territorial rights, the rights to control their resources, these people, the leadership down there, have always worked toward peace. They want peace, and the message was always clear from everyone we talked to, was that the United States had to get out of Honduras and had to end their war against them. And they knew then that they could build their future within the revolution. And in fact, it's a historical revolution in the sense that there are large identifiable Indian nations within the territorial boundaries of Nicaragua. And it then becomes important for us as Indian people in the United States to be aware of this reality, because in effect, it serves as a model for how revolutionary socialist democratic revolutions can relate to their indigenous populations. And obviously the United States is trying to alienate the indigenous peoples away from the revolution. It's almost like a laboratory on the Honduran-Nicaraguan border, and I think that they really feel, the people in Washington and the CIA who are engineering this war, realize that they're playing for big stakes. If they can alienate the indigenous peoples away from the revolutionary process in Nicaragua on the Honduran border, they can then do it in Guatemala, El Salvador, Peru, and other places where Indian people and all oppressed peoples are rising up to call for their human liberation.
Sure, if you could just switch the discussion a little bit, because I think you touched on a very important issue, which, like many other very important issues, hardly ever gets discussed in this country, and that is the role of indigenous people in Central America. I know there have been a lot of very terrible things that are happening in Guatemala and in other Latin American and Central American countries which do not get a whole lot of publicity. Could you perhaps chat about that for a minute?
You know, oftentimes as I've traveled around the country lecturing in communities, universities, I'm always asked the question, why are you interested in what's happening in Nicaragua? And of course we always get to the question of the indigenous people and how they evolve within the revolutionary process. And some of the contradictions that I like to focus on is the fact that here in the United States, the Congress of the United States continues to pass laws to force the Navajo people from their land at Big Mountain. We just filed a suit in the U.S. Supreme Court 3 days ago through the assistance of Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights. It was in the New York Times yesterday, on the White Earth Chippewa Reservation in northern Minnesota. In the 99th Congress, they passed a law that expropriates more than 200,000 acres of our land without our consent or without compensation. Our people are struggling to recover the sacred Black Hills, which they see as their Mecca, their sacred shrines, and they're having a great deal of difficulty doing that. So the point that I always try to emphasize is that there's no doubt that the American war against the indigenous people in the United States continues. Certainly it's not the Gatling gun and the saber, but it's the Congress of the United States and various federal courts making rulings that adversely affect us.
Tell us, because again, I think many of our viewers, and I certainly am not as aware of and understand as much as I should. What is the economic condition of the American view now in the United States?
Well, no doubt the people who first gave sanctuary to immigrants from all over the world who came here to flee from economic, spiritual, political persecution in their own countries reversed their role almost immediately, and the oppressed peoples of the world became the oppressor. And down through the years, for nearly 500 years, obviously, it's been a constant war to push us further and further from our sacred lands. Consequently, in a country where we, as the original landholders, I say landholders, we never thought we could own Mother Earth, should in fact be doing quite well. But we're at the bottom of every economic indicator in education, healthcare, housing, water systems. People who have visited some reservations said that they almost thought they were in a third world country in Central America, because essentially over the years the federal government, who's supposed to protect our lands and resources, have allowed its exploitation and not to our benefit. In other words, we have remained locked into long cycles of poverty, which breeds all the other problems that we are faced with. So the condition across the board is not good at all. Fact is, under the last term of Jimmy Carter, the total budget to all 300 Indian communities and Indian reservations across the country reached almost $1.4 billion. Now, people might think that's an awful lot of money, but as we know, the United States sends more money to the Philippines or Israel every year than they give to the original people here who have contributed the most. And so when we see the war continuing against us, we see the United States in 1954, after long periods of brutal suppression in Guatemala. The Indian people, of course, make up 85% of the 7.4 million people of Guatemala, belonging to 22 distinct Indian nations. Consequently, they gave popular support to the presidency of Arbenz in ⁴, who initiated land reform, started to take United Fruit Company holdings, paying them for it, but returning the land to the Indian peasants and other Ladino campesinos. The CIA moved into Nicaragua under the Somoza regime and Honduras and engineered a coup against this government. It's a known fact that since 1954, more than 100,000 victims have been claimed by the various military regimes and their death squads. And the Indian people, trade union leaders, political activists, students, intellectuals, no one is spared. Across the board, they make up the principal victims. Now, since 1980 alone, when the Reagan administration came in, the budget to Indian programs here have been drastically cut, now down, I think, below $900,000, $900 million, less than $1 billion for all the tribes. Money in healthcare has dried up. They've cut education. They've cut all the beneficial programs. And what we should point out, a lot of people think we're on America's welfare. But we made treaties with the United States, ceding the rest of the country for immigrant settlement while retaining certain reservation lands. Yet these lands continue to be under attack. At the same time, the federal government took upon itself, in consideration of these agreements, to provide us with adequate health care, education, and to provide for our general welfare in the sense of economic development, etc. Not welfare in the sense as we know welfare dole. The point, I'm trying to make some parallels here. While the war continues against us here, the United States government's support for these very brutal regimes in Guatemala is the principal cause of the fact that since 1980 alone, the Reagan administration's support for these governments have killed more than 50,000 Indians in Guatemala. Of the 70,000 victims in El Salvador in the last 8 years, more than 15,000 of these are Indian victims. And that was confirmed in a recent visit I had with Dr. Charlie Clements, who made the film For the Hearts and Minds about Vietnam, and then of course Witness to War, where Dr. Clements was working in the free fire zones in El Salvador. He indicated that the Indian people seem to be targeted as the principal victims for the death squads and the military. So while this is going on, we see the Reagan administration giving aid and support to Jonas Savimba in southern Angola, again turning indigenous people against their own people. And of course, now the Reagan administration would try to have us and the world believe they are champions of Indian rights, that of the Mosquito in Nicaragua. So I hope people can look through that kind of deceit that they're attempting to perpetrate on us. So across the board, from North, Central, and South America, the Indian people's lands and resources are under attack now after 500 years. So when we look at Nicaragua and we look at the relationships that's developing through the autonomy process between the Indian people and the revolutionary leadership of Nicaragua, we see that, and as they are rapidly seeing, that they have a chance to become a model as to how indigenous people relate to the revolutionary process.
Okay, Vernon, if you could slow up for a minute, because I'm not sure that all the viewers are familiar with what the autonomy process means. So maybe why don't you define the problem and point out what the government and the Indian leadership there are trying to do.
Well, first of all, this issue was never raised in Nicaragua under the Somoza regime, the question of territorial rights and the rights to control resources. This issue was only raised after the triumph of the revolution in 1979. And there are those that feel that the issue was raised as a valid issue, but to achieve other goals, and that is to sow division, confusion, distrust, perhaps to even dismember the national territory, which in effect would weaken the revolution and guarantee its destruction. So through this process, immediately after the triumph of the revolution, beginning in 1980, 1981, a dialogue developed between the Indian leadership and the Frente Sandinista, which is the political power that political party that is in power and elected into office by popular vote in the last election. And that finally evolved around to the Indian people organizing themselves in mass community-based organizations, so that through a democratic process of electing their leadership, they could in fact put up leadership that could carry on this dialogue. That eventually evolved into what is called the autonomy process, whereby the Indian leadership, particularly in the Atlantic coast, but as well the black communities of Bluefields, are participating in the autonomy. It's not just the Indian peoples. This process is being worked for the last several years to guarantee the territorial rights and the rights of the Indian peoples of the Atlantic coast to control their resources. Within the language, they talk about spiritual, cultural, linguistic rights.
When we talk about natural resources, for example, what are we talking about?
Well, predominantly we're talking about mineral resources, agricultural, fishery, and of course timber resources, even though the English occupied the Atlantic coast and really stripped off much of the timber, as did North American corporations, that there is still a lot of timber resources, mahogany. And so this is what the people are concerned, that the resources be developed in a way that benefit them directly. Unlike in the United States, where our resources are exploited for others, we remain locked into poverty. The process of autonomy is, language is being entrenched within the Constitution that guarantees their rights. We often said that we wish that we had similar language entrenched within the American Constitution. Perhaps we could have better protected our lands and resources. So we feel that the process working toward autonomous self-government, regional government, yet also having representatives in the National Assembly, such as Hazel Lau, who's been elected to the National Assembly, and of course we know that a very prominent Indian leader, Dr. Myrna Cunningham, is the governor, elected governor, right, a governor of her people. And so I think what has to be pointed out is this, is that unlike the Reagan administration policy that is trying to make it appear that there's brutal discrimination and genocide being perpetrated against the Indian people, almost totally the Indian people inside Nicaragua, through their leadership, are supporting this process, working toward autonomy, self-government, control of their lands and resources, and eventually working toward peace. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who have an understanding of this to expose the role of the United States. It's totally illegal, certainly immoral, in violation of the World Court, which found the United States guilty, I think, 12 of 13 counts, that the United States, that the government be persuaded to end this terrible, illegal, and immoral war against the peoples of Nicaragua. Obviously, it's not a military threat. It's not a threat to the security of the United States, but perhaps a socialist democratic form of government is what the threat is.
Well, I have said, many people have said, that really the threat to the United States is that if the Nicaraguan revolution succeeds, if, for example, you can significantly improve the standard of living of the people in that country, which is such a poor region, if they can deal effectively and fairly with the indigenous populations, then the threat to the United States is that you have an example.
Exactly.
An example of an economy and a society which is working in a democratic way with a government response to the people. And the people of Guatemala are going to look over to Nicaragua and say, my God, why are our kids dying at 1 and 2 years of age from malnutrition if it's succeeding in Nicaragua? And in a really horrible way, when you stop and think about it, what a terrible thing to do is to destroy a hope. A hope. And that's really, if you can maintain suffering and poverty throughout the entire region, people will say, well, there's no alternative. It has to go on. But if one country can succeed in being a good example, clearly other countries are going to follow that lead. And I think that's part of what the whole process of trying to destroy the revolution there is about. Would you agree?
Of course. You have heard different catchwords within this administration, such as, if we don't stop it there, it'll be on the Rio Grande, it'll be in Mexico, it'll be in Honduras, it'll be, well, of course it will. And the reason it will is not that the Sandinistas have to export revolution. No one has to export or import revolution. It comes from the people. It comes from the people of the land who suffered centuries of brutal subjugation. It reminds me of a quote from a great patriot and martyr of our people, Black Hawk. He tried to unify all the different tribes to give a check to the 13 colonies. And eventually, he and his people were forced to submit in what is now called Illinois. They were being hunted down by the American Contra, the military, the cavalry, at that time, and finally forced to submit to the forced violence and terrorism of the United States. And the generals asked Black Hawk a question. They said, Black Hawk, why do you insist on making war on us? As if they didn't know. And he, of course, thought it was a stupid question, and he responded this way. He said, you know our cause for making war. It is known to all white men, and they ought to be ashamed of it. Now, I don't mean to make it a racial meaning in that, but that was the reality. Our oppressor was, for the most part, 100% white, and he characterized it that way. But he said this. He said, we can never understand why it is you Americans always insist on taking with a gun what you could have through love. And when you look at that and look at Nicaragua, look at Honduras, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, where the campesinos, the workers, the Indian people have been brutally subjugated, inadequate health care, inadequate education opportunity, no opportunity for the most part, living in the most poverty-stricken conditions, illiteracy. You look and you see that the conditions in Mexico and these countries are ripe for revolution. And the United States has the resources, if they have the will, to go into these countries, as Black Hawk said, and with acts of love they could have whatever they want. Treat the conditions of revolution, but it's amazing that when you look at American foreign policy in Vietnam, in Iran, in Nicaragua, in other parts of the world, where they gave up support for these brutal regimes only when they were forced to by the American people, you would think soon they would look back and say, well, perhaps we've been making some mistakes and the military solution isn't always the best solution. And in Central America, the United States could go in. And I can tell you, wherever I've traveled these countries, there's a tremendous reservoir and outpouring of love and respect for the American people. The administration and the State Department are trying to transfer the guilt of the corporations and the United States government upon the shoulders of the American people to make it appear that we are threatened by these people. But in reality, the best ambassadors I've seen in Nicaragua and elsewhere are young American men and women who have gone down there and rolled up their sleeves and got to work with the people to help build their future.
Well, this might be a moment to point out, Joanne may want to jump in here, so I'm sure
Surely.
you're aware, Vernon, we have just recently sent down, was it 10
people.
10 people from the Burlington area who were living in Puerto Cabezas for 3 weeks, was it? Or
4 weeks.
4 weeks.
6 weeks.
Well, why don't you talk about it? But essentially what those people did is instead of going down there to blow up water facilities or to shoot medical workers, what they did is in fact build what, as I understand, is a very lovely playground in Puerto Cabezas. Joanne, why don't you just chat about that one for a moment?
Well, that's about it. They went down for 6 weeks, and 10 people from here, and actually there was another person who was in Nicaragua who met up with them, and they completed a playground in Puerto Cabezas, and quite a few of the people in Puerto Cabezas helped on the playground also, showing different techniques that they use, and right before they left, they put a thatched roof over the playground so that it could be used when it was very, very hot. And it was done, and they are back. The brigade is back in Burlington.
You know, and I think the point that Vernon just made, considering how much money, how much of our taxpayers' money is being used to go to war against third world people all over the world, probably for a fraction of that in terms of providing, in fact, it's funny, Cuba often gets criticized because of the impact they're having throughout the third world because they're sending teachers and doctors, right? And we're sending bombs and arming and murderers. You know, I couldn't agree with you more.
I've had a discussion even with business people. If people are not politically or morally moved to try to stop this war, in terms of just sound business principles, it's cost effective to go in and treat the conditions of revolution rather than to look for the military solution. And I've always maintained that within a short period of time, the United States could turn this situation around. You know, the United States, at one time, you could travel throughout the world, and it was one of the most respected governments in the world. And now I'm sorry to say it's one of the most despised. And people that listen to this should not feel guilty and allow the United States and the corporations who are exploiting these countries to hang that guilt on our shoulders. They're very cleverly trying to do that. They're trying to make it look like we are the targets, the American people. It's unfortunate that there are Americans who can't travel in the Mideast without fear of being taken hostage, but that's symptomatic. Until the United States changes its attitudes in these countries and looks at the cause of the revolution and the cause of the struggle as a just cause, the United States is never going to find peace in the world. You know, they're always on this quest for peace. Well, in order to find peace, you have to be peaceful people. You can't be going to these countries and destroying their countries through war, but go into acts of love.
The other point is that the polls indicate that the vast majority of American citizens do not support these policies of the Reagan administration. I think the last poll indicated it was 65 or 70% of the people do not believe in aid for the country. So it's not the American people who are perpetrating these crimes. It is really a government acting against the interests of the American people. Yeah,
it's somewhat frustrating. You know, what do we do about that? You know, we supposedly send senators and Congress to Washington. They're supposed to act for the people, and it's supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Seems to be word games. And when they go to Washington and we tell them, 65%, that no aid to the Contra, they vote the way they want to anyhow. And with the upcoming elections, I hope that people will really start examining where these various senators and congressmen stand on this issue.
Okay, I'm very sorry to say that I think we're going to have to cut the discussion off, at least for public access. And did want to thank you and your guests very much. And Vernon, maybe you might want to tell the viewers if they're interested in getting more information about the work that you and your compatriots are doing, how they might make contact with you.
Well, I'd like to suggest for the viewers in this area that they contact the Puerto Cabeza, Burlington, Vermont Sister City program here and project, and they can put us, they can put them in contact with us. The reason I'm saying that is that we are all over the country. We're here and we're there. It's kind of difficult to reach us sometimes, but that way we can get respond to their request and their inquiries.
The address of the Sister City program is?
The address of Sister City program is Burlington, Puerto Cabeza, Sister City program, 113 Church Street, Burlington, Vermont, 05401.
Is there a telephone number?
And you can call 864-0659.
All right.
Okay, well thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mayor. I really enjoyed the visit.